Welcome everybody to St Paul's this afternoon. As we gather, we acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, the traditional custodians of this land, past, present and future. We gather to give thanks for the achievement of the miners and citizens of this town at the time of Eureka and the Reform Charter. And at that, I think we'll just start. Who's next on the agenda? Hang on. Just because of just pretend. Okay, I'm pretending. You are almost welcome here. That's not
27th of November 1854. Resolutions passed at a public meeting on Bakery Hill, Ballarat. Given to H.E. by Mr. Black at the interview on the 27th of November 1854. At a meeting held on Bakery Hill in the presence of about 10,000 men on Saturday, November the 11th, 1854, the following were adopted as the principles and objects of the Ballarat Reform League. That it is the inalienable right of every citizen to have a voice in making the laws he is called upon to obey, that taxation without representation is tyranny. That being as the people have been hitherto unrepresented in the Legislative Council of the Colony of Victoria, they have been tyrannised over, and it becomes their duty as well as interest to resist, and if necessary to remove the irresponsible power that so tyrannises over them. That this colony has hitherto been governed by paid officials upon the false assumption that law is greater than justice because, forsooth, it was made by them and their friends and admirably suits their selfish ends and narrow-minded views. It is the object of the League to place the power in the hands of responsible representatives of the people to frame wholesome laws and carry on an honest government. That it is not the wish of the League to effect an immediate separation of this colony from the parent country, if equal laws and equal rights are dealt out to the whole free community. But if Queen Victoria continues to act upon the ill-advised of dishonest ministers and insists on indirectly dictating obnoxious laws for the colony under the assumed authority of the royal prerogative, the Reform League will endeavour to supersede such royal prerogative by asserting that of the people, which is the most royal of all prerogatives, as the people are the only legitimate source of all political power. Political changes contemplated by the Reform League. 1. A full and fair representation. 2. Manhood suffrage. 3. No property qualification for members of the Legislative Council. 4. Payment of members. 5. Short duration of Parliament. Immediate objects of the Reform League. An immediate change in the management of the goldfields by disbanding the commissioners. The total abolition of the diggers and storekeepers licence tax and a thorough and organised agitation of the goldfields in the towns. That to carry out the foregoing objects there should be a large tent erected in which to meet and conduct the business of the Reform League. Cards of membership will be issued in a few days' time and Ballarat divided into districts. At the same meeting, the following among other resolutions were passed. That this meeting condemns the insolent language used by the Colonial Secretary, the Surveyor General, the Chief Commissioner of the Goldfields and the Chairman of Committees for their unwarrantable assertions respecting the veracity of the diggers and the respectability of the representatives of the public press on the goldfields, and their sneering contempt and an appeal for investigation into the malpractices of the corrupt camp at Ballarat. That this meeting, having heard the draft prospectus of the Ballarat Reform League, approve and adopt the same, and hereby pledge themselves to support the committee in carrying out its principles and obtaining its objects, which are the full political rights of the people. That this meeting expresses its utter want of confidence in the political honesty of the government officials in the Legislative Council and pledge themselves to use every constitutional means to have them removed from the offices they disgrace. That this meeting also expresses its disapprobation of the mode in which the Board of Inquiry was appointed, that it ought to have been composed of independent gentlemen and not paid government officials.
First of all, thanks to Brett for creating this event and maintaining it over a long period now. I'd also like to thank Cassia for Welcome to Country, and I'm also like to endorse that. I'm glad we're meeting out in the open for this event. I know it's a bit challenging, but St Paul's is a beautiful church. It's long history. But to have a sense of that day in November in 1854, being part of that environment in which it took place, gives the day an added dimension for me. So 10,000 people gathered here. You can't imagine it. Flagpole 80 feet high. So that's a bit of a poor substitute. My first response always in coming here, though, is embarrassment. In our society, that we care so little for our those momentous events that took place in 1854 and shaped not just Ballarat, but the whole of Australia as we know it. I think it's not beyond the capacity of this crowd gathered here today that we do something about that. I just think we do need to have this spot acknowledged. And let's make that a target for this year. So you might ask, well, what's so special? What sets it apart? Why should we bother? That assembly, including many of the people who stayed and made their lives here, they officially constituted the Ballaarat Reform League at this spot to protest against the Victorian Government's mining policy and administration of the goldfields. It was not just a Ballarat issue, it was shared across the goldfields. While the discontent culminated here, the first public demonstration was in Castlemaine, where the monster meeting was held in December 1851. Now, Jan Wazitsky, some of us who remember him, were old enough to remember him, bushwhackers fame, he's got a great show at the moment celebrating that monster meeting, which is about to go on tour. It then continued at the Red Ribbon agitation in Bendigo, and went... Well, Churton's the monster meeting, really, Paul. The Red Ribbon Rebellion was just below the art gallery. They gathered there in 1853, and there's a stone, not a very auspicious statement, but anyway, there's a stone that tells you about that. The movement spread to most of the other large goldfields, but it was here on the 11th of November in 1854 that huge assembly met here and solidified the notion of a Reform League, and they adopted the Charter. They drew on the legacy from the People's Charter in Britain and on movements for democratic reform in Europe in the late 1840s as the basis of it. It had begun, though, in Britain, it began as a first attempt to shape parliamentary legislation. Up to then it had been a revolution, as we'd seen already in France and Italy and so on, but here it was, the British move was for legislative change. And it reached its peak in Victoria between 1852 to 57, of anywhere in the world, the notion of endorsing that. It begins, as Cassia has already read to you. The Charter begins with the following statement, that it is the inalienable right of every citizen to have a voice in making the laws he is called upon to obey, that taxation without representation is tyranny, and continued by stating the political changes the mind has considered necessary. Full and fair representation, manhood, suffrage, no property qualification of members of the Legislative Council, and so on, as we've already heard. Now, while the Charter was overshadowed by events at the Stockade, it is one of the most remarkable documents in our nation. In 2006, it was inducted into the UNESCO Memory of the World's Register of Significant Historical Documents. The concessions to the democratic government which followed produced a political framework and an atmosphere which facilitated the development of Australian trade unionism, which certainly happened in Ballarat, as I've learned through my study of the Ballarat Trades and Labour Council. In November 1855, Law and Humphreys became members of the unreformed Legislative Council, and in October 1856 were both elected to the first Legislative Assembly under the new Constitution. That was over 50 years before the Federation of Australia, and the Charter proclaimed two fundamental truths that give meaning to true democracy. The solemn words of the Charter, "The people are the only legitimate source of all political power," are joined with an insistence that every citizen possesses an inalienable right to have a voice in making the laws he is called upon to obey. The new Constitution was proclaimed in 1855, introduced the secret ballot in 1856, manhood suffrage in 1857, and triennial parliaments in 1859. It was not perfect. It entrenched a bicameral system of Legislative Council and Legislative Assembly, which maintained the colony's great social and property divide, but did it gradually incorporate the abolition of property qualifications for members of the Legislative Assembly in 1857, quite early. Not until 1950, I might have to tell you, for the Legislative Council. That is not long ago for me. I could also talk about the exclusion of women from participation, but not today. Universal male suffrage was a major step. This is one of the earliest examples in the world of white male suffrage. And today we also celebrate and remember Armistice Day, the end of the First World War. Most of the British soldiers fighting in the First World War did not have the vote. They only achieved universal male suffrage at the end of the First World War. Can you imagine that, going to fight for a country that wouldn't let you vote for the government that it elected? But they did. In Europe, throughout Europe, for that century, from 1815 to 1915, only about a quarter of males had the vote. So universal male suffrage was a huge thing to have achieved here in Victoria. France, I'm pretty keen on France at the moment. France was a glaring exception that it got universal male suffrage after the 1848 revolution. In the USA, they granted male suffrage in 1856, but gradually eroded it in most states, and it was only really in 1965 that voting rights were extended to African Americans and many other residents of the USA. And of course, we can't be too proud of our record either, because it was only in 1962 that our Electoral Act was amended to give Indigenous Australians the right to vote and enrol in elections. So the message I take from the Ballarat Reform League Charter is that progress is neither inevitable nor linear. We cannot take it for granted. We must work to make it happen. In my lifetime, we have been diminished by our treatment of Australia's First Peoples. We must adopt the Uluru Statement in the Federal Parliament. The consequence of the stolen children generation is still causing great suffering and pain today. I was watching last night Jack Charles on the television. He's one of them. He is still suffering as a consequence of that government policy. We've also been diminished in recent times by our treatment of refugees. We are still a multicultural society. It's important to remember that of the 101 miners officially counted at the stockade, only 4 were Australian born. The 97 other miners hailed from 19 countries: Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, Italy, Corsica, Greece, Germany, Russia, Holland, France, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, United States, Canada and the West Indies. That's pretty remarkable. Yet the exhibition was opened at Trades Hall on Sunday, 20 Years of Trauma and Resistance, the Ballarat refugee story, which I hope all of you have seen, is a sad commentary on how the promise of those early years have turned us into a fortress of John Howard's making. My friends, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. And as for Morrison's latest catch cry, can do capitalism, not don't do governments, goes a step further in diminishing our collective responsibility. Our Australia is everyone's responsibility. We were given a great start, but we must be brave and resolute as the people who stood here 167 years ago were, in shaping a society that reflects all of us. Thank goodness our forebears were more welcoming and thoughtful. I always come back to Clara Seekamp's statement in 1855, featured at the Eureka Centre. The population of Australia is not English, but Australian. Anyone who emigrates to this country, no matter from what clime or of what people, and contributes towards the development of its resources and its wealth, is no longer a foreigner. The latest immigrant is the youngest Australian. So long live the Charter as a challenge to us to build a better and fairer society. Thank you.